I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. Most existing therapies for multiple sclerosis do a good job at reducing relapses and inflammatory activity, but they largely fail to stop the slow neurodegeneration that drives long-term disability, especially in progressive forms of the disease. Immunic Therapeutics is trying to reshape the treatment landscape for multiple sclerosis with its experimental once-daily oral therapy designed to not only curb inflammation and relapses, but also tackle the neurodegeneration that silently drives disability progression in both relapsing and progressive forms of MS. Daniel Vitt, CEO of Immunic, discusses how the company's experimental MS therapy works, how it may protect neurons from cell death, and the potential for its dual mechanism of action to change the treatment landscape. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here today. Thank you.
We're going to talk about multiple sclerosis, Immunic, and your efforts to develop an experimental therapy to treat the condition. Let's start with MS, though. For listeners who may not be familiar with it, what is multiple sclerosis and what's happening at a biological level?
Actually, I think it's a really challenging indication which affects almost 3 million people around the world, which is leading to stepwise loss of physical ability due to neurodegeneration in the patients. And actually, there are two big indications part of multiple sclerosis. One is called relapsing multiple sclerosis, and the other one is called progressive forms of multiple sclerosis. And the bad thing about MS is actually that it starts pretty early in patients' lives, so diagnosed typically in the age of the 20s and 30s, and more affecting women than men, 4-to-1 ratio in relapsing MS and 1-to-1 ratio in progressive MS. So a pretty challenging indication.
And how does MS typically manifest itself and progress over time?
Yeah, today we know a lot about the indication. Usually in an early phase, it is detected maybe starting mostly with vision problems in most patients, specifically if they have relapsing forms of MS. Also weaknesses in the limb, so walking issues, feeling unsafe going forward, which is maybe the most prominent early observation in progressive forms of MS. But there are a couple of other neurological effects which happen.
There's now a long list of treatment options from oral medicines to more powerful biologics that dampen the immune system. What's the unmet need in MS today, and where do you see the opportunity for Immunic?
Yeah, this brings us now to the important point. So what's the unmet medical need? Because so far and maybe going back until maybe 3-4 years ago, it was believed that the majority of the disease is driven by inflammation, a so-called focal inflammation, and as the main clinical symptoms of that with relapses, right? So today we know that the underlying disability progression is driven by two things. And on top of the relapse activity, this is driven by also a smoldering destruction of neurons, which leads to a silent worsening of the physical ability of the patient. And this is the unmet need. And now on the current treatments, all of the treatments we have right now are focusing on treating the inflammation and therefore mainly or even exclusively targeting relapses and the relapse-related worsening of disability, but are not targeting the unsolved problem of continued smothering neurodegeneration, which is independent of the relapse activity and focal inflammation.
Your experimental therapy, vidofludimus calcium, is an oral pill with dual activity. What is it in simple terms, and how does it work?
In very simple terms, it's an activator of a protein called Nurr1, which is a nuclear receptor protein. It's a small molecule. As you said, this can be therefore be applied as a pill once daily, easy to use treatment option. And as a Nurr1 activator, it's first in class, and that is targeting to directly protect neurons from cell death. And that's a new mode of action. It's a new target for MS. And this, I think, really has the potential to change the way we treat MS in the future. And it brings me back to the question you asked before on the current treatment landscape. So this really goes beyond what current drugs have shown and are targeting. On top of the effect on the one, it is also, and this was originally the concept when we developed the drug in earlier years, was also to inhibit DHODH, a protein which is part of the pyrimidine metabolism. And in a very simple word, is stopping overshooting inflammation in patients.
Mechanistically, this inhibits a mitochondrial enzyme called DHODH and activates a transcription factor known as Nurr1. What role does DHODH and Nurr1 play in multiple sclerosis, and how does inhibiting one while activating the other help treat the disease?
Yeah, it sounds more complex than it is. So the very simple word is DHODH inhibition. As I said, it's a protein which is a essential protein in the novel synthesis of pyrimidines, which means if you inhibit DHODH, it activates a stress signal pathway only in cells which have an overshooting turnover of proteins and therefore of RNA. So it is intrinsically a selective target for stopping an overshooting immune reaction. So in simple words. And this was proven to be efficacious in MS because there is a drug called Obagio, which is used for treating relapsing MS. And that is targeting DHODH as the main target. Whereas Nurr1 is new, so the activation of Nurr1 goes beyond that anti-inflammatory effect. So Nurr1 activation has actually shown to directly protect neurons from cell death. We have shown that in several model systems. We've shown that in vitro, for example, in a culture of human neurons, where we see that in a dose-dependent fashion, we can protect neurons from cell death by a neurotoxic cocktail submitted here to this cell culture. And also we come to that maybe later in the discussion, also translates into a clinical benefit on protecting from disability progression as well.
There's also been a link made between MS and the Epstein-Barr virus. Can you explain that connection and how the drug may address Epstein-Barr virus activity in MS?
Yeah, maybe to bridge here the two things together, I think targeting DHODH is also known to be antiviral, and we knew that from the very beginning. And we knew that the drug is more or less broad-spectrum antiviral, which is not only good from the EBV point of view, which is related to multiple sclerosis directly, but also protecting patients from reactivation of other viruses, which is good because typically in therapies which use immune modulation, that could be a problem if you have increased risk of infections. And we don't have that with DHODH inhibition, and we don't have that with vidofludimus calcium. But on EBV, I think this was one of those big things in science in the last couple of years. There was a big publication in Science published, I think 3.5 years ago. And that was based on 10 million person US military cohort study, which showed that the MS risk is increased about 32-fold after EBV infection in a certain period of time in the life of soldiers. And that is more or less the proof that EBV is a prerequisite to develop multiple sclerosis later in your life, if you have that infection. Typically, this is in the late second decade of life, so in the teeny age of patients. That's one thing. Then there's a second publication recently showing, and that's maybe more something on the ongoing MS progression, that in patients with active multiple sclerosis, there is an increased signature of T cells, so immune cells, which are targeting an epitope, which is linked to Epstein-Barr virus. And that is cross-reactive with some signatures in the human body, which is related maybe to maintaining the active disease ongoing and progressing.
Oh, what's known about vitiligo from studies you've done to date?
Well, the first thing is it's pretty safe. That's key. I think if you look on current treatments in multiple sclerosis, there is a difficulty and a challenge everywhere. So we're very glad that the drug has shown to be really safe and well tolerated and easy to use for doctors. And secondly, and then this brings us to MS directly, it has shown in two independent phase 2 studies very good data. And one is the emphasis study in relapsing MS, a phase 2 study where we've tested 268 patients, tested 3 different doses, and we found that the 2 doses, 30 and 45 milligram, have shown a very similar, very strong reduction of the inflammation. So the first part of the disease activity is treated and shown to be treatable here with a reduction of 76 to 78% on cumulative active lesions and gadolinium-enhancing lesions in the brain of patients. This was measured by MRI imaging in the patients. Secondly, we also have seen biomarker effects, for example, on neurofilament light chain measured in the serum of the patients. And we have seen first hints of neuroprotection by a very low rate or reduced rate of disability progression in a patient in that emphasis phase 2 clinical study. In a second phase 2 study, and this was data from last year, we have tested the activity in patients with progressive forms of MS. And this is interesting because in progressive forms of MS, there is no treatment for patients approved in non-active secondary progressive MS, and there's only one treatment approved for primary progressive MS, which is a drug called Ocrevus, an infusion from Roche and Genentech.
What signals are you watching most closely, and what would you need to see to call this a true progression slowing drug?
Yeah, I think bottom line, we need to really look on the clinical outcomes. And clinical outcome to detect progression is so-called time to confirmed disability progression. And we have 2 different versions. One is a 12 and the other one is a 24-week confirmation period. So we have either 12 or 24-week confirmed disability progression or disability worsening. That's the same thing, just 2 different codes for the same thing. So really measure in a patient to what extent is the disability score worsening, and this is a sustainable effect in the patient, or is it going back to normal? So that's the most important clinical endpoint there. But there are more parameters to watch in these patients.
The phase 3 program in relapsing MS uses time to first relapse as the primary endpoint, but you also have key secondary endpoints around disability, cognition, MRI, and brain volume. Which of the secondary endpoints do you see as the most critical for changing practice if the trials are positive?
I think for the treating physician, of course, the primary endpoint is important. Do we see a reduction on relapses with the drug as a primary endpoint? That's, of course, important. And also for the regulatory filing of the molecule and acceptance by the regulators, by the FDA, that is important. But I think from a doctor's point of view, safety is very important, and how easy is it to use and apply the drug. But for the patient, I think still the confirmed disability progression is that's the elephant in the room, right? So we really want to make sure that patients have better opportunities and better treatments for stopping or slowing down the disability progression.
When you talk to MS specialists, how are they thinking about vidofludimus in their minds? Is it a first line oral alternative, a step up after traditional orals, or in some cases, a substitute for biologics?
Well, I see if you talk to neurologists and to treating doctors, I think in relapsing MS, there are two specific groups of patients where we think this offers a new treatment opportunity which could change the patient's life. And of course, in progressive MS, that goes beyond that because there is a huge unmet medical need. And with all the challenges recently in developing so-called BTK inhibitors, that is getting more and more urgent every week right now. Let me start with RMS first. So in relapsing MS, I think the two main groups of patients which really waiting for treatment, like vidofludimus calcium, are patients early diagnosed, which want to have a safe and well tolerated treatment um, because of the limitations of the current drugs available there, and easy to use in case of a form of an oral. So I think one of the key options here is to really be the leading oral drug in the future to treat relapsing MS. And given that that MS, RMS specifically, is a switch market, so patients are on a drug for some period of time, and then either for safety reasons or lack of efficacy, patients switch to the next treatment. We think patients have now an opportunity, if we get it approved, to start early on it and to avoid the risks associated with current drugs. But secondly, also to switch to that treatment if they are treated with a established therapy like an S1P modulator, and then don't tolerate it or the efficacy is not sufficient enough to switch over to our treatment. The second big group is, and this is more to do with the recent developments in the anti-CD20 space, is that we have a switch option which does not have an increase of virus infections, and specifically that primes vidofludimus calcium to be the switch options for patients who need to stop current anti-CD20 therapy.
The anti-CD20s like Ocrevus and Kesimpta have been effective, but come with trade-offs in terms of infections and monitoring. Are there patient profiles you think an oral therapy like vidofludimus might make more sense than starting or staying on an anti-CD20?
Yeah, I have this is the perfect question for what I said before. Exactly. I think we first need to admit that anti-CD20s are currently the leading treatment opportunity for MS patients with relapsing MS, maybe also with PPMS right now. But they come with these issues of increased risk of infection specifically, and maybe also with a statistically increased rate of cancer risk here. Um, we don't think that we should go against that. I think if patients are willing to accept those risks, it's maybe an opportunity to go on these treatments right now. But then we will have a switch options for the patients of the anti-CD20s if they experience, for example, severe infections, or come to an age where the infection risk just gets very high and patients should switch to something else. And I think vidofludimus calcium is the perfect option for patients to switch on coming off an anti-CD20 therapy. But going back to my earlier answer, of course, patients now should have an option to choose and go on such a therapy as vidofludimus calcium earlier to avoid the risk associated with a treatment like an anti-CD20 therapy if they feel that is a better balance here.
As you mentioned, progressive MS has been hard to treat. If the future data are positive, do you see this being used in conjunction with other agents to treat progressive MS, or do you think even by itself it might have power there?
Absolutely. And it brings me back to my very first statement in this interview. I think the unsolved issue is neurodegeneration and therefore progression of patients. And that, of course, that's the hallmark of progressive MS, is that there's just progression and these patients have little to no inflammatory disease activity. And the problem is that the current treatments, and that includes also the approved drug Ocrevus, most of the activity, and this is shown in as part of the clinical trials published for these drugs, is really coming. A big benefit is coming from the anti-inflammatory activity, um, and and our drug goes beyond that. So with the Nurr1 activation, I think we have for the first time a mode of action which by nature could be neuroprotective. And with our clinical data we have shown, I think we could be a game changer here. We could be the drug of choice, which also works in progressive MS patients which do not have an active inflammation as the cause of progression, but a progression independent worsening of disability ongoing. So I think this could really be a game changer in progressive MS.
Earlier in this discussion, you stressed that this had a very positive safety profile. Patients often stop oral therapies because of GI side effects, hair loss, and lab abnormalities. Uh, how do you see this being a significant advantage for you? And how do you communicate that to both patients and clinicians?
I think this is more important than we usually think, because if you're a patient, you want to make sure you don't have, if you're going to treatment, you don't want to have a treatment which is maybe causing bad things by solving another problem, right? So therefore, safety, I think, is super important. And I think so far, I'm very glad that the drug has shown in all the randomized study we have run, has shown a very nice and benign safety and tolerability profile. So we don't see an increased rate of GI side effects in these studies. We don't see hair loss increase or lab abnormalities. So I think the drug may really be an easier to use option also, which also is giving an advantage for the treating physicians as well, because patients don't need to come maybe into a doctor's office very frequently to do monitoring in these things, which we believe um, would be a big differentiator as well for the drug.
And if all goes well, how soon might you be able to file for a regulatory approval? And how does the progressive MS program dovetail with that?
Yeah. So I think we are waiting to read out the data end of this year from the two INSURE studies, from the two phase 3 studies in relapsing MS. And if successful, this would lead to an expected filing of an NDA in the mid of 2027, so mid of next year already, which then, if positive, will allow us a launch in mid of 2028. So not too far from now, we hope to be able to launch the drug in relapsing MS. And as said earlier, I'm very happy that we are able to initiate and start a phase 3 clinical trial in primary progressive MS or PPMS. And the plan is really to kick off such a study in the second half of this year. And if everything goes well, we hope to read out such a study in 2030.
You recently announced an oversubscribed private placement of up to $400 million with $200 million in upfront proceeds and another $200 million in warrants tied to phase 3 results. What was the thinking behind structuring the financing that way?
I think the most important thinking was fully fund the program, right? So the phase 3 readout, the NDA submission, and also starting the PPMS phase 3 studies. And secondly, to tranche it in a way as the capital is needed. So we don't need the 400 million right away. So 200 million now in February and another 200 option here with the data coming in end of the year and giving investors a 30-day time period to execute the cash warrants here. Will then equip the company with the second portion of 200 million.
And how far do you expect that financing to take you?
Well, the 400 million would really cover the even the commercial launch of the drug and also the PPMS phase 3 costs. So I think we have a pretty solid financing situation right now going forward.
you brought in a group of high quality specialist investors at a time when the funding climate for biotech has been improving. But have you seen a change in what investors are most focused on? And what were the toughest questions they pushed you on?
Of course, the last 3 years have been very tough for financing companies in biotech. I'm very glad that we were able to really here execute such a strong financing with really good names, top tier investors. I think it's the combination of the advanced stage of the company, really reading out phase three data in less than a year is one of the important ingredients here. But also the de-risking. So we have, for example, we performed an interim analysis of the phase 3 studies in 24. And that also is attractive because it reduces just the binary risk of clinical trials for investors, right? So we think that with the interim analysis there, it is also increased the likelihood of success for the study for investors. And of course, maybe not to underestimate just the fact that that the financing is so big is also part of the success. So it was highly oversubscribed, and it was really highly oversubscribed. A really huge order book here, and we really needed to cut back most of the investors substantially here. But that also is a safeguard that if needed, there is flexibility for the company, and it's not just binary and short timed on the rise near the finance.
This financing has been described as helping Immunic transition from a late stage R&D company into a commercial stage biotech. How are you thinking about building commercial capability versus staying lean and finding a commercial partner?
Well, first of all, to be acquired is not a strategy, right? So Um, therefore, to be successful, you need to, and if you believe in the asset as we do and investors do, you go forward. And I think it's a straight thing to launch it. And we have seen it's possible in such an indication. It's a huge market, but you don't need a huge sales force to cover the key sites here in the United States. So it's something we really feel capable here. And it's an independent path forward. And it just requires, I think, to add the right people here to the company, to the team. I think this is important, and we are in active process on doing that. We are currently hiring a lot of people with respective experience from our friends at Pharma right now. So all in all, I think it's a good straight strategy for the company. And if a pharma company believes it's the right time to partner, we have an open door. I think they can still knock on the door and ask us. If they come with something interesting, it's maybe also an attractive opportunity.
Daniel Vitt, CEO of Immunic Therapeutics. Daniel, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.